Awesome. So, hi everybody. My name is Yuval. I've been an Agile coach for a while, doing different things. Last couple of years, I've done more and more in business and organizational agility, and that's typically the place that you find OKRs. So I've been starting to think about and do some work in what's the connection between OKRs, objectives and key results, alignment, the strategic level, where does that meet Scrum and agility, and how can we use Scrum and agility to support alignment initiatives? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So very high level, what we're going to cover today using an OKR format of the objective is learn how to effectively use OKRs, leveraging some Scrum and Agile thinking and theory. Some key results that hopefully we'll achieve for you by the end of this session is to have a high level understanding of OKRs, the why, the what, the bit of the how. Describe and identify some implementation challenges you might encounter when you're using OKRs or your organization is using OKRs, and some ideas for how to overcome these challenges. As a wider perspective, maybe we can call it bonus key results or aspirational key results, be able to describe how we can use Agile and Scrum practices to help improve any OKR implementation, including those that happen outside of the Agile Scrum context, and maybe even pitch Scrum as a solution to flailing OKRs. So let's jump right in. So what are OKRs? So if you look at what most people are familiar with in the world of OKRs, most people read Measure What Matters, or watch a talk around Measure What Matters that John Doerr wrote, that introduces OKRs as they were used in Intel and then in Google. But there are other books that are as good as, if not even better, on the concept of strategic alignment and execution using concepts similar to OKRs. These books are The 4 Disciplines of Execution, Radical Focus by Christina Wodke, and Silos, Politics, and Turf Wars by Lencioni, that is a sleeper hit in this world, in my view. Generally, what we're talking about, and maybe Lencioni provides the best introduction to this concept, is that a lot of organizations face situations where there are silos, there are politics, there are turf wars, there's an ongoing grind. Covey and his co-authors call it the whirlwind that gets you working on everything to the point that nothing is really important. And what you want is to be able to execute effectively across the organization on what matters most, what's strategic for you right now. And in order to do that, you will need to overcome these silos, politics, turf wars, the ongoing grind. And the way we do that is through objectives and key results that provide us with focus and organizational alignment. So OKRs stand for objectives and key results, a collaborative goal-setting methodology used by teams and individuals, organizations even, to set challenging, ambitious goals with measurable results. And when you do that, OKRs are how you track progress, create alignment, and encourage engagement around measurable goals. That's the definition in Measure What Matters. And more organizations are learning from Google and other venture-backed companies and starting to use OKRs as the way to manage their strategic execution. Like every good thing, once you use it more widely, you start to have issues. People start to misunderstand the intent, forget some of the important things in the theory about OKRs, and Jerry Weinberg called it the law of the raspberry jam. We spread it too thin, we start to lose the taste, and that's happening with OKRs as well. It's not because OKRs are evil or bad, it's just a matter of nature of the beast. One issue that we see when organizations are using OKRs is they have too many of them. Too many OKRs. Everything becomes an OKR. The organization feels like everything needs to map to an OKR, otherwise it doesn't exist. It creates a situation where we're using OKRs to manage the whirlwind, and that's not the intent. What would happen in the organization is there would be too much work in progress overall. There would be lack of clarity around what are the priorities, too much context switching, and when everything matters, nothing matters. Okay, so that's a problem. And there are two problems that are hidden here. One is that generally the organization is doing too much, and that's a problem that we need to address with flow, with limiting the amount of work in process. The other problem is that we're not clear on how to use OKRs effectively. So I'll actually start with, if you are doing too many things in the organization, you need to start to apply focus and flow and start finishing rather than starting everything. But within that, we need to clarify to ourselves that not everything needs to be an OKR. An OKR objective with key results need to be used to develop your strategic differentiators, the things you're trying to really move the needle on as a business. You shouldn't need an OKR to just run the business. You can have key performance indicators in what we call our operation or operational value stream. We should make sure that these are an ongoing concern, something that is in our dashboards that we're tracking towards, and that might drive some work in the organization. OKRs are for the big things, the big changes, the things we really need to focus on. That might mean 20% of our organizational capacity. It might mean 10%. It might be 80%. It really depends on the context. But not everything needs to be mapped to an OKR. So that's one first important step in addressing this challenge. Figure out to yourselves, what's our ongoing operation? Where are our real developmental work, developmental value streams? We need OKRs for these developmental works, growing the business versus running the business. Once organizations start to think about that, we can start to have conversations around what's different between the work that we do to develop and grow the business versus the work to run it. And since you're Scrum Masters of the universe, you're probably starting, your spidey sense might be sensing that there's some difference in the level of complexity of the work to run the business and change or develop the business. Whether that work is within product development, whether that work is organizational, when we're developing, when we're trying to address a major crisis or a major growth opportunity, there's typically more complexity, uncertainty, volatility around what's useful, what's valuable, which direction makes sense, and how to actually get there versus just running the business. So if we take the next step, we need to think about, okay, what does that mean for OKRs that we're doing them in a complex environment? More complexity. So one thing that is more important when you have an environment that is complex is that you don't know upfront what's the right solution for something. And in that environment, it's an issue when we see OKRs that are output and activity focused. When we're prescribing what are the tasks, what are the milestones, instead of talking about outcomes, we might not be doing the right things. We might be fixing our specifications, our designs too early in the process. We might end up with, a feature factory if we're in product development. We might not leave enough space for autonomy and innovation. We might find items on our OKRs that are very prescriptive of what's the solution, what's the task even, that the activity that we're focused on, rather than what's the outcome that we're looking for. It's like if you take the world of user stories, it's like focusing too much on the activity or what we're trying to build and not giving enough space because we're not providing the why. We're being too prescriptive around we need this button rather than we need to enable this behavior, this experience. So what should we do? At the minimum, we should start by growing this spidey sense, this language around what type of OKRs do we have? Is our objective output focused, outcome focused? Is it a milestone? Let's feel free to use those when we look at our objectives and key results, and let's be willing to accept the fact that we have such types of OKRs, not hide this fact. Let's bring transparency to the level of OKRs that we're using, and then use that transparency and inspection adaptation to shift towards more outcome-focused objectives and eventually key results. You can see here on the right some examples of how you might switch from output-focused OKRs to outcome-focused OKRs. So instead of releasing a version, the more outcome-oriented objective might be, we want to increase our market position in the autonomous delivery market. That's what we're trying to achieve through this release. There might be other things that achieve this outcome better. And you can see that the key results as well change from fixing, let's say, 10 major critical defects to actually what we want is to improve the customer satisfaction rating. That's the outcome we're looking for. The next level would be to actually make the key results not just outcome-oriented, but also quantifiable. So improve customer satisfaction rating, that's nice, but increase net promoter score from 35 to 60 is much more quantifiable, clear, provides the starting point, the finish. We need to get from A to B in a certain time period. So what we do by focusing more on outcomes is we assume variability. We preserve our options to figure out different ways to achieve the outcome based on what we learn along the way. We enable decentralized control. We give people clarity and alignment using the outcomes we're looking for, but we're giving them the space, the autonomy, and the agency to figure out what are the activities and the outputs that would deliver the outcomes that we're looking for. We're also providing the space for learning around whether the outputs and the steps that we're taking are actually heading in the right direction. So we're actually allowing ourselves to collaborate and figure out what's really working. Taking this to the next level would be to actually talk about empiricism. Now, empiricism, looking at all of the writings around OKRs, empiricism is pretty implicit there. Few people in the OKR space explicitly talk about the fact that we need to have an experimental loop, that OKRs are an hypothesis, an idea around how to get somewhere, idea around an outcome that might be valuable, that we need to validate. We need to validate both how to achieve a certain outcome, what are the key results that we're looking for and how to achieve them. We also should be open to inspect and adapt our strategic goal itself. are we even heading in the right direction? Maybe we can learn about the relevance of the objective itself. And that's where evidence-based management comes in. Evidence-based management provides the theory that supports having a healthy OKR implementation, not just alignment, but alignment with empiricism. You might call it question everything, trust no one. God we trust, all others must bring data. But bringing empiricism into your OKRs is something that few organizations are doing. And as Scrum Masters, with a lot of background in empiricism, transparency, inspection, adaptation, and tools around that, we can really help organizations do it much better. I'll pause here to see if there are any questions so far. So far, so good. We will have a Q&A at the end, but if you have a question that comes to mind along the way, feel free to type it in the chat. I will pause once in a while to take a look. So we talked about two issues so far. One is too many OKRs, so everything becomes an OKR. The second thing was OKRs that are too prescriptive, to task or activity or output oriented rather than outcome oriented. The third major issue we see is once we start to use OKRs across the organization. OKRs in many cases start as a conversation at the leadership team, trying to align across members of the leadership team as they see that it's helping them align and work cross-functionally and deal with, the silos and the turf wars. They start to say, okay, let's use it throughout the organization. And as you're starting to use OKRs throughout the organization, a lot of organizations fall into the trap of what we call cascading, which is basically setting OKRs for different groups top down. Meaning we set an OKR at the organizational level. We will tell the different departments, functions, what their piece of the OKR needs to be. And when we have that strict connection between the OKRs at the different levels, that typically leads to having task or output orientation by the time the teams create their OKRs or are given their OKRs, which is even worse. And that kills autonomy, that kills empiricism. People just end up, doing an old style work breakdown structure and losing the beauty of OKRs, which is to achieve alignment while providing autonomy. At that point in time, the way organizations use OKRs is actually more similar to the precursor to OKRs, which was called MBO. If you've been around the block for a while, you're maybe familiar with MBOs that focus on, the what, they're top down, they're not providing a lot of space for aspiration, they're not really providing the space for people to come up with innovative ideas and for empiricism. OKRs were actually designed to address some of that. They were a bit more agile through the fact that the cadence around OKRs was quarterly or even monthly. They were more transparent, shared across the organization. And the intent is for them to be bottom up, sideways, influenced by the organizational OKRs, but they're set up by each organization setting their own OKRs. And ideally, they're divorced from compensation, because once we tie those things up, we immediately create a lot of issues with transparency, aspiration, willingness of people to really take on aggressive potential to fail work. So we want to actually avoid those tight cascades that pull us back to MBOs. How do we do that? We need to figure out a way that balances both alignment and autonomy. The way organizations do that is they use high-level OKRs. Alignment is important, but as opposed to the previous diagram, we don't have these direct, strict connections between the OKRs in the different levels. Team of teams in the organization, they define their own OKRs, bottom up and sideways. They do align or relate through something we called why now. So each OKR that we set somewhere in the organization, we provide the reasoning, why are we doing this right now? That might be a local reason within this area. It might be what's the theme that the organization is focused on, but it will still be a standalone OKR. It might be a bit harder to manage. The fact that we have autonomy, that we're driving towards autonomy, creates some complexity in managing things. It's very tempting for organizations to fall back to schemes that enable them to command and control and have more clarity. We need to be careful with the fact that a lot of these times, these schemes kill the autonomy. So we need to be very careful in how we play on this field. So if issue number 4 was, how do we avoid command and control when we scale OKRs across the organization? We're continuing with the organizational theme here. And issue 5 is that many OKRs do require collaboration and dependencies management across the organization. If we're trying to move the needle on things that are really strategic for the organization, the nature of the beast is we might need multiple functions. We might need to cut across different areas, whether that's marketing, HR, sales, product development, product management, HR. This is a challenge, right? Having a set of OKRs that each map to different teams and managing how we're doing on these OKRs requires us to work on different teams. And this is some serious coordination overhead. So it's very tempting to actually try to divide and conquer, maybe even cascade into output or tasks OKRs for each group and what they're focusing on. The reason it looks like output and task OKRs is because each one of these domains or functions or disciplines cannot really own outcomes on its own. They do need to collaborate. So one option is to divide and conquer. Another option is to maybe organize around value. Organize around the fact that, okay, we have a set of OKRs that require coordination across functions. Can we create what we call stream-aligned teams that would have people from these different functions that really have all they need in order to work towards these outcomes together, to collaborate towards these outcomes? Can we let these people work in an empowered, decentralized fashion without always going up to their leads? So one important consideration is, let's look at the way we're organized, not necessarily the organizational structure, but we sometimes call it the network of teams that we use as an overlay in the organization, and assessing what products should we have, what teams should we use, what's the right topology, using an OKR lens, using the lens of what are we really trying to focus on right now, what's strategic for us that should drive who should be working together. Once we do that, once we have people that are on teams focusing on something strategic, and once we have these teams where people are focused on a small set of strategic things, because each one of these teams would be mapped to a specific OKR. then we unlock both engagement and motivation through purpose. It's much easier for these people to understand, well, why are we doing this? What's really important for us? How does that relate to what the organization is trying to achieve? So it's a really powerful play, although not an easy one. So at this point, you're probably already seeing some, some smells of, Scrum could help here, right? We're talking about things that Scrum talks about: organizing around value, working in an empirical manner, working on a smaller set of things that's, flow or focus from Scrum. A lot of these issues could be addressed by using Scrum, but not all of them happen in the place in the organization we typically use Scrum at. Scrum is typically used in most organizations in IT and product development. I'm doing personally more and more work these days on using Scrum and agility elsewhere in the organization. But in broad strokes, I think it's fair to say that OKRs or any sort of goal-setting mechanism is used across the business typically, while Scrum and more structural agile ways of working are typically happening just in parts of the organization. So elsewhere in the organization, we don't necessarily have the right operating system to implement empiricism and organizing around value and working in a way where OKRs would not be something that you set at the beginning of the quarter and then forget about during the day-to-day. So that's one issue, and also the potential to start to use Scrum more in the areas in the business that currently don't use it, but we need to do that carefully. The other issue that happens is that at some point, the organization has conflict and overlap when we're trying to implement OKRs and follow and use OKRs. And in some areas of the organization, there's Scrum in place or whatever agile method you want to use. And then there starts to be some confusion. What do we use for sprint planning? Do we use the product backlog or OKRs? What's the mapping between, product goals, sprint goals, OKRs? When do we create OKRs? Who creates them? How do we keep them realistic? How do we use pool mode to create OKRs? How does that relate to the fact that the team, when we're using Scrum, the team should be the one that, the people that pull the work and sign up for the work? How do we make sure that that happens when we're setting OKRs as well? OKRs are typically set for the quarter. We plan sprints in Scrum. How do we cross, this gap? So there are a lot of questions there, and solving all of these mapping challenges might be more than we can cover today, but that's exactly what organizations are starting to look at. One example of a way to bring these two worlds together is to leverage OKRs in the sprint review. So in the sprint review, as a reminder, we don't just look at our increment, and the sprint, we also look at what's our product backlog, what's our product goal, what are the current business conditions. And that's a great opportunity to take a look at our OKRs. What are they right now? Are we green on these OKRs? Have we started to work the outcomes that we need? How can the OKRs and the ongoing steady state KPIs of running the business, how do they look like? What can we learn from inspecting our OKRs and KPIs in order to decide what needs to change in our product backlog? We might learn that, there's something we need to do to keep a KPI healthy or to bring it back to a healthy state. We might decide that, there's work that we need to pull to actually advance an OKR. This is something that can also happen in backlog refinement. So the product backlog should tie to what are OKRs right now. We can also map OKRs to product goals. So especially if we create a team that's focused around an OKR, it should be an easy mapping between the OKR and the product goal. If we have an ongoing team that maps to multiple OKRs in the organization, that would be a tougher mapping. But it's also a smell that maybe we need to think about, are we organized effectively to deliver value in the areas that are really important to the organization? In a sense, the sprint review in an OKRs world can be a way to implement the experiment loop that evidence-based management talks about. Inspecting where are we? Have we achieved our immediate tactical goal? Maybe that's our sprint goal. What's our next intermediate goal? Maybe that is a quarterly OKR. Are we on track to achieving our strategic goal? Maybe that's a yearly OKR, company OKR, maybe that's our product goal. There are different ways to do this mapping depending on the context of the team and how we created that team around the work. So those are important considerations to think about. The important thing is not to say, yeah, we're doing Scrum, we don't care about these OKRs. Not to say, yeah, currently the way OKRs are used is pretty evil and disruptive. The right way to think about it is, what can we do to leverage OKRs to help us deliver value as a team? That's, the basic stuff that Scrum Masters can focus on. Like we say that Scrum Masters don't just coach the team, they also coach the stakeholders around the team and the organization. I think, and I've seen, we can use Scrum and Agile principles and practices to support how the organization uses OKRs and to help us drive towards business agility. Whether that's by using Scrum theory like empiricism and empowerment and continuous improvement, whether that's by using Scrum and Agile concrete practices like product ownership and sprints and sprint reviews. Any of the Scrum and Kanban flow elements can actually help in many situations when we're applying, trying to use OKRs at the business level. More and more organizations are realizing the need for business agility and start to understand the role that OKRs with some, Agile spice on top of them or Agile seasoning on top of them can do to support business agility. So let's pause here. And I want to ask you if you've seen OKRs in an organization, or just based on what I've talked about, even theoretically, which of these OKR implementation issues or smells resonates the most for you as something important to try to address? You can answer this by going to polev.com/AgileSparks. I'll type that in the chat and just type in your answer. I see there's a question about PI objectives. That's a safe term. I don't know if we want to dive deep into safe today. We'll see. We'll do a Q&A session later on. Feel free to add that question, Yuval. I hope I'm pronouncing that well. And you will have a chance to each vote on which questions you want to answer. It will be on the same link that you're now seeing. So we'll see what questions does the audience most want to address. If that's PI objectives, I'm happy to talk a bit about that. So we're seeing quite an even spread of, the issues with collaboration across the organization and command and control, some scaling issues, getting a lot of votes here. So if you are using OKRs in your organization, one thing that you can do is actually use this slide deck, which we will share later on, and go in and assess, how are we doing? Which of these issues can we recognize? And that can help you think about what countermeasures does it make sense to deploy against them. All right. So if you want to dive deeper into this topic, so I mentioned a couple of books, right? Some of them are here. There are some articles that talk about some different elements that I talked about here. For example, the topic of operational value streams and development value streams, the evidence-based management guide from scrum.org. How do we organize around OKRs? How do we fix OKR theater using Agile Scrum principles? Different resources for you to look at. If you're looking for some more formal training around this, the PAL-EBM class from scrum.org is a great option, one-day workshop to dive deep into how to effectively do goal setting in an empirical manner that supports alignment and autonomy. It's not a class about OKRs. It's a class about how can you level up how are you using any sort of goal setting mechanism like OKRs or 4DX or whatever. As you can see, this is a space that I'm really interested in and writing some more stuff on. If you want to connect and follow, best place to do that would probably be on LinkedIn. So here's a link to that. And with that, I think it's a good time to start our Q&A session. So the way this works is you can type in questions on Poll Everywhere. Everybody would see those questions on their screen, everybody that's in Poll Everywhere, and people can vote up a question. Vote up a question if you want to also get an answer to that question. We'll take a couple of minutes to see some questions coming in, and then I will start to answer them. Feel free to also add questions and vote them up as we're doing that, and we'll just deal with the flow of questions as it comes in. And again, please use the link for the questions. That way we can vote on who really wants more answers on a certain question. So I see several people are interested in the overlap of PI objectives and OKRs. So PI objectives, I will start talking about that while we see more questions coming in. So PI objectives are basically program increment objectives. So that's a set of objectives that we set in SAFe, in the Scaled Agile framework, for an Agile release train, a team of teams that is planning work for around 8 to 12 weeks. Planning in high level, they're not planning the details. It's not a replacement for sprint planning. So one important thing that we do when we're planning that program increment in an activity called PI planning is, rather than focusing on exactly what's going to be the output or the work, the stories that the teams are committing to in each one of their sprints, they're doing some simulation of what they'll be able to work on, and they're crafting PI objectives. So that's a higher level, outcome level conversation, ideally, of what these teams and together the Agile release train would be able to achieve in this PI. These objectives provide something similar to what the sprint goal and the product goal provide with Scrum and what OKRs provide as well. They provide alignment. They provide communication to both the teams as well as stakeholders outside the organization around what are we focusing on. They also provide the ability to adjust based on what we learn along the way, to assume variability and preserve options. In the sense that having a PI objective doesn't mean we know exactly everything that we'll do in this PI. It actually gives us the space to figure out different ways to achieve that objective. So that's pretty similar between PI objective and OKRs, which kind of raises the question, do we use OKRs for PI objectives? Can we use that language? Typically, we don't. Why don't we? Because in PI planning, if you've seen that, there's very little time to craft very detailed objectives and key results. Coming up with good PI objectives is hard to begin with. Getting to the level of quantitative measurement of well-crafted OKRs during PI planning is kind of hard. There's still, I would say that's still an area of innovation in what's the right way to do safe OKRs using Agile principles. Some initial thinking is that it might be useful to turn PI objectives into OKRs after PI planning as an offline activity to improve the OKRs. If you do have OKRs in the space that are informing your Agile release train, those OKRs should be input into the PI planning process. And in general, the way PI objectives are set in PI planning is pretty aligned with how OKRs should be set as well. So that's a relatively quick answer on that question. So I'm gonna hide that question now, and then let's move to the next one. So would I say that sprint planning is the event where OKRs can serve as input? I would say it's probably an event where OKRs can serve as input, but mainly I would say it's the sprint review and refinement, because the way I look at sprint planning is we go into sprint planning with a well-formed and prioritized product backlog. Sprint planning is not a prioritization event. It's a planning event. So OKRs are indirectly input in the sense that they should inform product owner decisions around priorities in the product backlog. But it's not the main place where we discuss OKRs. I hope that makes sense. Feel free to ask a follow-up question about that. How can we measure OKR ROI? So that's a good question. You probably might look at setting an OKR for your OKRs implementation. So what's the objective? What are we trying to do in the organization through the implementation of OKRs? Typically, it would be we're trying to address some misalignment issues. We're trying to address people are struggling to work effectively across functions in the organization. The key results might be people are more engaged, decisions are made faster, we're able to achieve better outcomes in areas that are strategic for us. But it's really a good question to make sure we ask in the organization before we implement OKRs, why are we doing that? What would be an indication that we are successful? What's the measure for OKR success? How do you engage team members in OKR definitions? Well, you use a process. My take on it, you use a process that's pretty similar to the process for, backlog refinement, sprint planning in Scrum, a process where we bring in the OKRs from elsewhere in the organization, from other groups that are next to us, from the big organization we're in. And we might even bring in a draft objective that's based on what our area needs to provide. And then we ask the team members, and a good first question is, which team members do we even have? Is the right way to do this to bring OKRs into the existing team? Maybe first we need to figure out what are the right teams to work on these OKRs. A lot of the time, OKRs don't necessarily map one-to-one to the existing teams. So we could use whatever OKRs exist with our existing teams just as a constellation of things that might influence us in our world. And then maybe a product owner would come in and say, okay, for our area, this is what I'm thinking the objective could probably be. But they would involve the team members in crafting realistic, while aspirational, key results. So similarly to sprint planning, where the product owner brings in a draft sprint goal, the team is figuring out what's possible. And it's a negotiation around what's the sprint backlog and what the eventual actual committed sprint goal would be. A similar conversation can happen in the context of OKRs, even if we're not using Scrum. It's just that this way of engaging people is useful. OKRs, outcome-based roadmaps, lean value tree, are all these different flavors of the same concept? I'm not familiar with lean value tree, so I cannot answer there. I think there are specific elements in the theory around OKRs that might not be part of outcome-based roadmaps, but you tell me. Try to look at everything that's in OKRs. Is that one-to-one with these other things? Maybe. I don't know. Please explain. So the rest of these only have one vote, so maybe time for one or two more questions. If you really want to vote up a question, now's your chance to affect what I answer next. So I'll just choose for now the question that I want to answer from these three. Let's stay with the first one. So please explain, aren't PI objectives outcomes rather than goals? You see, we define them after the planning rather than leading the planning. Well, the fact that we define them after the planning doesn't mean that we achieve them. They're still, planned outcomes, which are not that different than planned goals. Outcomes is not, in the OKR world, when we say outcome, we don't mean a lagging indicator, or we don't mean we've achieved these outcomes already. What we mean is that we set the objective in a way where what we're focusing on achieving is an outcome. We're not talking about exactly how to achieve that outcome, but we're saying right now, this is the outcome we want to achieve. So for example, moonshot. John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, saying we want to reach the moon, put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. That's an outcome. That's also a goal. That's a goal or an objective that is set as an outcome. Kennedy, I mean, I don't know the detail, but I'm sure that some level of planning happened to make sure that this was aspirational, but there was, you know, some realism there. So there was some planning. It wasn't detailed planning of exactly how to use Gemini and Apollo and what would happen in Apollo 5 and what would happen in Apollo 6 and how to react to different things. That's an empirical process that happened later on, a more detailed and empirical process that happened later on. But the goal was set using an outcome framework rather than what are the activities that we're setting. I hope that makes sense. Happy to continue the conversation on LinkedIn or elsewhere later on. So I think that's all we can answer with the time that we have. So at this point, I will stop sharing. And
okay. Yep, and we're about 1 minute before the hour, Yuval. I just want to say thank you so very much. This was amazing. And I'm really glad it's recorded because I'm going to even have to go back and watch it again myself just to write more notes. I think this is really helpful. One question is, some have asked if you'd be willing to share the slides with me or a PowerPoint of the slides that I can send out to the group when I send the video recording link.
we'll do.
It looks like you're already nodding yes, so that's perfect. And I'm seeing lots of kudos in chat for you, Yuval. So again, thank you so very much. And to all of you who came today, thank you so much for joining us at Scrum Masters of the Universe. And we hope to see you again, even maybe as soon as Thursdays with Bob Galen. Be a good session.
Thank you, Jamie.
All right. Thank you
everybody
so
for the
much.
great
Everyone
questions.
else.
My pleasure.
Yeah, really great questions. All right, everyone, have a great rest of your day, evening, wherever you are in this world.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yuval.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Awesome presentation, Yuval. Thank you.
Thank you.